Good evening and welcome to the lecture in our public lecture series for Psyche, which is Science Gallery Bengaluru's fifth exhibition. Science Gallery Bengaluru, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is a public institution for research-based engagement. And as a part of our public engagement program, essentially what we organize are research festivals or exhibition seasons. Today's lecture is by Alok Sareen. His lecture is entitled The Paradox in Psychiatry. Alok is a practicing clinical psychiatrist in New Delhi with a strong interest in medicine, psychiatry, ethics, society, history, and literature. He has been active in clinical practice since 1985 and is currently attached as an honorary consultant to the Sitaram Bhartiya Institute, New Delhi. He has received the senior fellowship from the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for research on mental health aspects in history. He has conceptualized Canvas Askew, a public forum for addressing mental health and illness concerns and issues. For those of you who are not aware, there are many other programs that are also going on. So tomorrow we have Hamlet's Live, which is the third episode of a performance event. And we have Shubha Tole from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research speaking on sensory perception from genes to brain circuits. So thank you for joining us today, but we also look forward to welcoming you tomorrow. Do remember to type in your questions in the Q&A box, and we would love to have your feedback on how you think about our programming. And I myself cannot wait to hear Alok's lecture now. So over to you, Alok.
Thank you, Janavi. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Science Gallery, Bangalore, for this, for what I think is actually a very interesting and very necessary endeavor of the effort to bring science and scientific discourse into the public commons, as it were. Speaking of mental health and the paradoxes, and paradoxes abound in mental health. And we're going to be talking about mainly one of them, and this is what is called the advanced directive in psychiatry today. The advanced directive is only one of the many areas of paradox in mental health, mental illness. Psychiatry is an interesting discipline. It's one of the youngest disciplines of medicine. It's something which over the last century has developed at a fairly dizzying pace. And at the same time, it's also one of the disciplines, probably the discipline in medicine, which has generated and attracted perhaps the greatest amount of debate and controversy as well. And we're going to look at some, or at least one part of this, and try and explore that bit a little more today. To step back a little bit, what we're going to look at today is what is called severe mental illness and what that is. And many may well ask, what is severe mental illness? Because that ultimately is the heart of the paradox. Is there mental illness, or is it a societal construct? Is it that people in difficulty react in a way? But severe mental illness, and if we leave that debate aside for a bit as to what it entails, the issue is about both the adherents and the critics of severe mental illness. And one of these processes, one of the processes associated with severe mental illness is the process of what is called involuntary hospitalization, involuntary commitment, involuntary institutionalization. So the question is that if a person, if an individual is experiencing what we call a psychotic episode, an episode of illness in which he or she is experiencing fearful thoughts, delusions, voices which are called hallucinations, is going through what can be a terrifying experience for that individual. Should that individual who is in imminent danger of doing harm to either himself or herself or to others, should that person be hospitalized to administer care, to administer treatment, whatever available treatments there might be? Or should that person be left to his or her own devices? We leave aside for the moment as to whether that hospitalization or commitment is a safeguarding of the individual or whether it is a safeguarding of society from that individual. The fact of the matter is, of course, that it is both. And and we will also not go into the debate as to whether in this process of hospitalization, good and bad things have happened. And of course they have. Good and bad things have both happened. Institutionalization or hospitalization has not always been what it is meant to be. And at the same time, it's not necessarily always been as problematic or as bleak as it has been portrayed. But for the moment, if we were to leave that debate aside, should involuntary hospitalization happen to a person who is experiencing this let us say this psychotic or so-called psychotic experience? And ultimately it boils down to, and this and to further step back, this person is, because of the nature of the problem, unwilling or unready to accept help. Because if the person is ready to accept, there wouldn't be a problem to begin with. So the question is really here, which right of the individual are we going to privilege here? Are we going to privilege his or her right to autonomy, agency, and choice? Are we going to privilege the individual's right to safety? Are we going to privilege his right? Does he or she have a right to appropriate treatment, even if he or she is not only not asking for it, but is refusing it? Does society have a duty or a responsibility to ensure that that treatment is given, even if the person is unwilling or unready to accept this? And this, in a sense, is the heart of the question. So what is it that should be done? And clearly, there have been situations where many people have been treated involuntarily, have benefited from that treatment, and have been grateful for the help that was rendered unto them. And there have been many people who have been mistreated There have been people who have been treated unwillingly and it has not worked out well. There have been people who may not have been ill to begin with. So all sorts of things have happened. And this, in a sense, is what mental health legislation is meant to, or should, I think, be looking at, as to what the boundaries are where institutional treatment or involuntary treatment should be given or not given. And in that process, how sensitive or how empathetic we are to the individual's human rights at that point of time. How do we balance those rights? And those debates and those discussions have been what have characterized a psychiatric debate. So essentially what we're talking about is two concepts: the concept of autonomy and agency, and the concept of involuntary treatment for severe mental illness. And how do we marry these seemingly irreconcilable concepts as they were? So we'll go back a little bit. We'll talk about the history of this. And there's a fascinating paper which anybody who's interested in this should read. It's by a gentleman called Thomas Sars, written in 1982, and it's an excellent paper. It's called The Psychiatric Will, a New Mechanism for Protecting Persons Against Psychosis. For protecting persons, as he says, against psychosis and psychiatry. And it talks about the administration of what is called a psychiatric will. To be absolutely accurate, it's not an entirely original idea. And Sals says this, it had been talked about for a few years before that. But the idea of the psychiatric will has been associated with SARS. SARS, as many of you might know, is also and was an active proponent of what is called anti-psychiatry, denying completely. SARS, by the way, was a psychiatrist who denied the reality of mental illness. But here, what he's talking about is in his words, an olive branch to psychiatry in the form of the psychiatric will. And he uses a fascinating, interesting tool, which is called the Ulysses principle or the Ulysses clause. It's been variously called the Ulysses clause, the Odysseus clause, and it's the story of the Greek hero, Ulysses. You all know, I'm sure, that Odysseus is the original Greek name of Ulysses, and the Latin or the English version is Ulysses. So Ulysses is, in his voyages, the captain of a ship, and this ship is sailing through, I think it's the Aegean Sea, and there is this island, and this is the Isle of the famed mythical Isle of the Sirens. And the song of the Sirens is bewitching. And everybody who hears the song of the Sirens is entranced. And they come closer and closer to the isle, and what happens is what inevitably happens in a situation like this. The ship runs aground because there are treacherous reefs. Let me quote from the book of Odyssey, which it's a translation from the Greek. It says, then at last, the lady Circe spoke to Ulysses, saying, even so, now all these things have an end. Do thou then hearken, even as I tell thee, and the god himself shall bring it to the mind. To the sirens first shalt thou come, who bewitch all men, whosoever shall come to them. Whosoever draws nigh unwittingly and hears the sound of the sirens, never doth he see wife or babes stand by him on his return, nor have they the joy of his coming. But the sirens enchant him with their clear song, sitting in the meadow, and all about is great heaps of men, corrupt in death, and around the bones the skin is wasting. Sounds horrible indeed. But do thou drive thy ship past, and knead honey sweet wax, and anoint it in the ears of the company, lest any of them hear the song. But if thou art minded to hear, let them bind thee in the swift ship, hand and foot, upright in the masthead. From the mast rope let ends be tied, that with delight thou might hear the voice of the sirens. And if thou shalt beseech thy company and bid them to loose thee, then let them bind thee with yet more bonds. It's wonderful. He is told to sail past the isle. He's told to get his crew to put wax in the ears so that they don't hear the song of the sirens. They stick to the predetermined course so that they don't run aground. He will hear the song. He will tell them, go closer, but they have been told not to follow his instructions. So he is doing what is called self-binding, literal and conceptual. He is bound to the mast by his own mandate. And he has ordered his crew not to listen to him. So he's telling them that at this time, even if I tell you to do something, do not listen to me. It's a fascinating concept. It's a truly delightful, imaginative concept. And this has been used as a tool for, and the metaphor is that of mental illness, that in times of competence, in times of wellness, I will decide for myself that if I fall ill, if I fall ill and the illness which is like the song of the sirens lures me, then I am going to bind myself. I'm going to bind myself with my decree. I will prepare that decree now, and I will say that if I fall ill, please make sure that this is what is to be done to me. So it's actually a brilliant concept. And it tries to bridge what in many ways seems to be unbridgeable, and to facilitate communication between the individual, the service provider, and society, using this mandate, which is the advanced directive, which is called the Psychiatric Advanced Directive, or the Ulysses clause. An elegant solution to a very complex difficulty. The trouble is that it doesn't actually seem to work. And it's not surprising, because when you unpack it, the difficulties become obvious. The first difficulty is that it's not just the individual, the service provider, and society and the tool. It's also the individual, the current self of the individual, and the future self of the individual. Philosophically, how correct or how valid is it for me to direct my future self to behave or to be treated in a way that the future self does not agree with? Which self is more valid? Is this self more valid, or is that self more valid? But that's a philosophical, that's a purely ethical or logical objection. The larger objection is this, that if I believe in the reality of mental illness, if I believe that something like episodic psychosis might exist, or if bipolar disorder is a real thing, and if I think that, that maybe I may have another episode of mania or depression, in the mania I might be prone to spending large sums of money, and I should be treated or restrained in that point of time. And in that point of time, if I was to be treated, then I would like, drug A to be used and not drug B, because I've not had a great experience with drug B, or I don't want electroconvulsive therapy to be used, or I want electroconvulsive therapy to be used, or whatever. Then I'm, then I can write all this down. I can write all this down if I believe that there is something called mental illness, and I might be prone to mental illness. So, in a sense, it works. It works till it doesn't work. It works. It works where it is not actually needed, because I can do all of these things without the legal tool of the advanced directive. I can do this, I can discuss this with my family, friends, with my treating doctors. If I don't believe in the reality of mental illness, and I think that, it's not going to happen, and I don't want to be treated, even if I'm behaving in a certain way, then all of this is meaningless in any case. Then, as some authors have said, this olive branch actually turns into what has been called a thorny thicket, because this offering was made that it might actually decrease contentiousness. It may decrease involuntary hospitalization. It might make the problems much less. However, if the mandate is of no treatment, then, as we will see, it might actually, in a sense, increase contentiousness, acrimonious legislation, or difficulties in that communication. So, in effect, it's a solution that perhaps doesn't really work. In a very well argued piece, some authors Chodov and Peel have likened, as I said, the olive branch to a thorny thicket. And they've talked about why the psychiatric will and the living will in what is called end of life crisis. Because the other place, if you remember, where the living will is used is end of life crisis, which is that when I am in a position where I am no longer able to articulate my view, if I'm in coma, for example, and I'm not able to express my desire, how would I like to be treated? And there is the concept of what is called the living will, which says that, if I am in such a situation, then I would not like to be put on a ventilator, or I would not like to have intensive treatment. But there's a big difference between the living will, as Chodov and Peel say, and the psychiatric will, because in the living will in end of life, it's not, what is happening is that I'm unable to express my desire or my mandate. In the psychiatric will, what I'm saying is contrary. It's not that I have no ability to express. I may be saying that I don't want treatment. So it's much more complicated than the living will of the end of life. And we'll come to the living will, which is in any case not simple. Rebecca Dresser, in a similar critiquing of this of the advanced directive bit of the Ulysses clause, talks about how it's not necessarily all that simple when we move from literature to law, and how the bipartite clause, which is Ulysses and his company, his crew, there are two people, two parties, as it were, to this contract. When we change it into a tripartite clause, which is the individual, service provider, and state, which through legality is mandating this. And if you take it one step further, it's the future self. So it can be a quadripartite clause. It becomes unimaginably much more complicated. So what does this mean in real terms? In real terms, there are a number of very interesting examples. Some troublesome, some not so troublesome. There's a very interesting case, which is that of a lady called Nancy Hargrave. I'm saying the name because it's all in the public domain. These are all papers that are published. Nancy Hargrave versus the state of Vermont, where this lady had made an advance directive. She obviously had an episode of mental illness where she was treated. Her experience with the treatment was less, shall we say, than satisfactory. She did not want to go through that experience again. She made an advance directive that she should not, if she ever experienced anything like that, be treated. So she has made an advance directive where she should not be treated. Time passed. As things happen, she did develop another psychiatric episode, and her behavior was disturbed. And then you must remember that in the US, where much of this mess actually happens, and where most mess actually happens, in the US, the broader law, the general law, which is of involuntary commitment, if somebody is disturbed, if behavior is disturbed and they are deemed to be a threat to themselves or others, she was admitted because her behavior was considered unsafe for herself. So she's admitted, but she signed an advance directive that she should not be treated. So she's admitted in a mental hospital in the state of Vermont, but she cannot be treated, which led to a hugely difficult situation. And there is a very well articulated, almost anguished judgment, many pages of it, in which the court says that, look, she has said that she does not want to be treated. So in all fairness, we cannot treat her. But given the fact that her behavior is so obviously disturbed and she is becoming a difficulty to herself, so forcible treatment is then offered. It just became hugely problematic, causing the authors of this paper, which is Swanson et al., to say that the new psychiatric advance directive statutes contain a very large contradiction. Amongst the provisions, often it is, let the patient decide, which in effect means that in many situations, it becomes that the advance directive boils down to let the doctor decide, or perhaps more accurately, let the doctor decide when the patient can decide, because it doesn't actually simplify anything. In another similar case, Shiv Shankar et al. Describe a fairly piquant situation where a gentleman is admitted to a psychiatric facility. He's treated, but because he has written an advance directive about a certain type of treatment, it could not be administered to him. And it's anybody who's interested in the concept of the advance directive and the difficulties that it can cause should read that paper. Fortunately, that story has a much happier ending than the Hargrave versus the state of Vermont story. In India, there is writing on the advance directive. And there are quite a few papers. There are 2 or 3 papers. The difficulty is that, when we talk about our experience with the advance directive in India, it's, by the way, it's part of law now. It's part of the Mental Health Care Act, 2017. And so there are papers which say that people have written the advance directive. But before we do that, let's just step back a little bit. And when we look at the writings on advance directives, what is it that we are talking about? We often tend to think of it in rather simplistic ways. And the one way is that if this gives the individual autonomy, then of course it's a good thing. And then if we don't need to think anymore about this. The second is that if this reduces the importance of the family in traditional societies like in India, then it can't be a good thing. So it's not correct for India. The third is that India is a resource-poor country. Many of the people who suffer from or experience severe mental illness are poor, are uneducated, lack the psychological sophistication to be able to understand the concept of the advance directive. And so therefore, in India, it's not a great thing. So we should not be talking about advance directives in India. I think that none of these positions is actually valid. I think they're all deeply problematic. The first is the ideological position. The idea or the concept that anything which empowers the individual, which increases agency or autonomy, is a good idea, is is obviously it's difficult to argue against that, and nor do I think that there should be an argument against that. Nor, in all fairness, can there be an argument against that. The question is, how best is it to be done? Is it through the legal tool of the advance directive? Everybody who writes about the advance directive admits and understands that the law is a blunt instrument, and that using blunt instruments to affect societal change is fraught with many problems. So is this the best way? Can there be other ways? And I think that perhaps we haven't actually thought this through enough. If we rephrase the question, it may read a little bit like this. While we are all agreed that the individual should have agency, is the route to that agency through the advance directive, or are there other routes? In the management of psychiatric disorder, an understanding of the fact that recurrences and relapses can happen. See, it boils down ultimately to the same thing, that if we think that psychiatric illness is real, if we think that it is a thing, then the fact or the likelihood that it can happen, and it can happen again, is also a thing. Then we need to figure out how it is that we're going to deal with this. Then that process of that thinking needs to be slightly different. Then it can't, or at least in my thinking, it shouldn't be the legality of it which determines that discourse. It should be a process which incorporates as much of all of these processes. However, what has happened in the West is that, because of what is called the Self-Determination Acts, there has been historically a very strong lobby which talks about autonomy, as a standalone individual process, which is not to say that autonomy is in any way or in any case a problem or a difficulty, but how do I go beyond the binaries of this or that? As I said earlier, even in the end of life crises, there are many papers which talk about how I, as an individual, am going to plan for a future self which is compromised. And they find, and there are many papers to this, which find that the young and healthy person thinking about the future and the infirm, old, frail, vulnerable person thinking about the present have completely different views. Not surprisingly. The question is, how well do I know my mind, or how well do I think I know my future selves when those future selves are vulnerable or frail? And in that, the deciding of oneself or the privileging of oneself over the other is perhaps a little questionable. We're not even going to go into what the advances of medicine might be, or whether, whether at that point of time, some treatments will have happened. Leave all that aside. Let's just think about deciding today for tomorrow. There's an excellent Cochrane review that was published some years ago, which took all the literature on the advanced directives and tried to analyze them. You know that the Cochrane reviews are what are called meta-analysis, which just takes all published literature and tries to, make sense of it. And ultimately, and the two important things that come about are, one, that the advanced directive is not one thing. It's not just a single entity. There'll be many things. There's what is called advanced care planning. There are joint crisis plans. There are crisis intervention cards. And there is the legal tool of the advanced directive. And they're all very, very different. The difference is the using of the legality or the using of the participatory conciliatory method of looking at the world and looking at the future of a collaborative decision making, as opposed to the the confrontative discourse, which will automatically endow all of this with. And if you go back to the paper that we talked about, Shiv Shankar et al., what they talk about and the conclusion that they come to, and it's a very recent paper, a couple of years ago, is that advanced care planning certainly seems to work. The advanced directive by itself is perhaps a little questionable. There's a lot of writing from India. And however, the writing from India, as we talked about earlier, a couple of these papers are from Chennai, and it talks about how effective the advanced directive was. But there's a little sleight of hand here. What they talk about is how even people who may not be amongst the most educated or amongst the economically empowered are able to write the advanced directive. They are able to participate in the writing of the advanced directive, not in the legal enforcement of the advanced directive. They talk about what actually should be advanced care planning. Everybody can participate in advanced care planning. Autonomy can be built. Agency can be supported. And with that, many things can happen. It doesn't have to be either or. The use of this as I said, as a legal tool or as a collaborative clinical tool is perhaps where I think we might want to pause and think a little bit about. The other part of this is that, using legality for something like this is a bit of a difficulty. Again, this is not to suggest that psychiatric interventions or psychiatric treatments have always covered themselves with glory or have been free of any difficulties, that it would be naive and foolish to believe that. However, looking at legal interventions to solve medical management issues then leads to an afterlife. It creates narrative and it perpetuates the narrative. In a sense, it is the creation of a particular narrative and it drives that narrative further. And that is perhaps, as a society, something that we might want to think of. We have, in the meanwhile, as I think all of you will know, passed the Mental Health Care Act, and the Psychiatric Advanced Directive is very much a part of law, as it is in many other countries. There's some countries which are still debating it. There's some countries which have been using it or not using it. And much of the writing about the advanced directive is a bemused wondering as to why don't more people use it. It's such a good thing. It's almost heresy to question the idea of the advanced directive, because it empowers people, it increases the autonomy, it increases agency. Why can it not be a good thing? The problem is the way that it is done. And I think that we might want to think a little bit more about it. I think I'm slightly ahead of time here, and I think I've crossed it by a few minutes. But anyway, I will stop here. And if there are questions or comments, I'd be delighted to have to hear them. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Alok, for an interesting lecture. And I'm and this is sort of a feature of our public lecture series, which is that we see people, scholars from across disciplines coming at the idea of the psyche, for example, in this case, from deep disciplinary knowledge, from deep expertise, and then sort of ideas and concepts and patterns kind of repeat themselves, right? Like, so yesterday we had Ted Porter talking about, what one might call distributed sites of knowledge production. So, what were the institutions that have been historically interested in creating scholarship about the human mind, and how that began to congeal, in a sense, by the mid-19th century in a particular format that we actually find familiar today. And so the question I asked him, and there's a reason for this prologue, of course. The question I asked him was, in a sense, could he tell us, because there are institutions that were interested in the human mind. So, schools, prisons, places that later, mental hospitals, as they were called at that point of time, asylums, etc. So they had very specific motivations for noting down a person's state of mind, including the church, of course, and church notebooks, for example, on family and family histories, etc. So there were very specific purposes to which these institutions needed to know more about the people they were seeing. But at some point, it starts coming together, and it congeals in different ways, and state knowledge about citizens, in a sense, starts coming together. And so my question to him was, what was the motivation, right? And what was the motivation to do this? I mean, apart from sort of saying that it is in the interest of the state to know its citizens better. And his answer was, in fact, indeed that. And Ted has written a huge amount on the rise of statistical thinking, or the history of statistics, which is, of course, state knowledge or state-driven knowledge. And it's to me, interesting how you come to it as address the same concern in a sort of how should I put it, in a very, very focused manner, right? So I'm going to ask you a version of the question that I asked Ted yesterday, which is that what is it that motivates the need to understand and control the mind, especially of those we do not comprehend or cannot control?
So what we need to guard against is what I think of as unitary tellings of the tale. Is there one reason? No, there is never going to be. Is there one Ramayana? No, there isn't ever going to be. There are different stories. You know this, that with the same anchor points, we can tell radically different stories. And in different situations. Of course, they will all be true. Is there the mental hospitals are an example of this. Were the mental hospitals built and run as places of asylum to give succor and help the people who were admitted in them? Were they meant as places of incarceration? Were they places where people got better? Were they places where people were exploited? The answer is yes. To all of them. Terrible things happened in mental hospitals. Wonderful things happened in mental hospitals. The stories of exploitation, of mistreatment, of bleak, dark despair in mental hospitals are plethora. We don't even need to go into them. That is what I would think of as the dominant narrative of the mental hospital. At the same time, in 1936, in a small town called Ranchi, which now is famous because of Mr. Dhoni, there were two mental hospitals. There was a European mental hospital and an Indian mental hospital. The Indian mental hospital is run by a guy called Dhunji Boy. And this is 1936, almost, just short of 100 years ago. There's a gentleman, a Marwadi gentleman, who is not eating. And he's not eating because of what we would think of as melancholia. He's suffering from severe depressive illness and he's not eating, he's starving himself to death. So somebody asks him, what can we do to help you to eat? So he says that I will eat if the Governor General of Bengal comes to request me to eat. So what do? They actually dress up somebody as the Governor General of Bengal with his retinue and try and convince the person to eat. It doesn't work. He doesn't eat. I think ultimately he dies. But the fact of the matter is that they are treating him as a human being. They are treating him as an individual. They are dignifying him, his request. Thunji Boy, the superintendent of this mental hospital, writes that the essence of care is to stand alongside the patient in his suffering and see the world from his point of view. So, did all this happen to understand the person? Did it happen to control the person? Yes, all of this happened at different times. When we go ahead, how are we going to be able to bring together all that is what we think useful, what we think necessary, what we think beneficial, and take that forward so that it's not that human misery or human suffering or difficulty has got any less, despite all of this. What is it that we can do to try and alleviate this? And in that, perhaps, questioning what it is that went before, trying to understand through, lenses. Many lenses will be flawed. Many things will be, I think that many places we would have gone wrong. How do we layer those lenses on top of each other to try and strive towards a better understanding is perhaps the answer. I don't know whether this answers the question. or obfuscates it.
I think it, I think we do need a deeper discussion at some point, and we hope to sort of bring you back to it, etc. Because again, what happens is, and I'm aware that there are two other questions that I should ask you before the session is over. What happens is, as you said, that there are these and as historians, we learn about contingency, convergence, and of course, convergence would require more than sort of a factor or two. But that having said, in a way, what carries weight, what carries historical weight, right? Like, and I think those, because that also tells us about how society changes and how perception of the mind, perception of the person with the disordered mind is also undergoing transformation. But I don't think that takes away from what you've said, but I think we just need to kind of probably have the time to work it out better, and maybe we will. But I should do justice to the two questions that have come. So Arun wants to say to you that some 8% of the human genome relating to the brain has finally been fully mapped a few weeks ago. Do you think this could lead to new psychiatric treatments? How valid should we deem advanced directives that were made when awareness of such potentially significant changes in treatment regimes did not earlier exist?
So, will the mapping of the human genome lead to changes in psychiatric treatment? Possibly, but that is yet, it's a chapter yet to unfold. Should this make the advanced directive invalid? I don't know. To my mind, there are enough fallacies in the conceptualization of the advanced directive to begin with, even without this. Because I think that the advanced directive is actually a very, 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 very blunt tool. I think that we do need to think towards the future. I think that we do need to be aware, and we need to let all that is happening influence the way that we look at the world, not only today, but what is going to happen in the future. But I think the advanced directive is perhaps not necessarily the best way to be doing this in any case.
Okay. So the next question we have is from Harish Dhawan, who I believe is a good friend. Agency of the present self implies the lack of agency of the future self. And he says, you said so. And you assumed and supported the goodness of autonomy and agency of the individual. Aren't these at loggerheads?
So this is the paradox. This is why there are so many paradoxes. The privileging of one agency against the other is the difficulty. The agency of self is not in question. But then neither is the agency of the future self. Which is it that I'm going to privilege? As I said, if I believe, and here we are talking specifically in the context of mental health, of if we believe in the concept, let us say if I have bipolar disorder, if I know that I'm prone to getting episodes of mania and depression, and I believe, rightly or wrongly, that there's a possibility that I might have another episode, and I'm willing to write an advanced directive that this is what should be done, and I use that really fascinating tool of the Ulysses clause to do this, that's fine. However, the fact of the matter is that if I am doing all this, I don't need the Ulysses clause. Then I didn't go into this, but there are many different types of advanced directives. There is what is called the instructional directive. There is what is called the proxy directive. The instructional directive will talk about what can or cannot be done to me. It can talk about the sort of treatments that can be used or not used, or the modalities of treatment. The proxy directive is guardianship.
Mm.
Is that there is, I nominate a representative,
Yeah.
or the state nominates a representative, and then the decision making is by the proxy directive. The decision making is by the proxy, the nominated proxy.
Mm.
And again, you know, anybody who's read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or anybody who's been following Britney Spears in her interesting journey, knows that proxy directives can be hugely problematic. They can be hugely beneficial as well. So it is, do I need to be aware of something, or the way that this is going to unfold? Yes, I need to think about it. Is the advanced directive the only way to go? No, I don't think so. I think there are many other. Is there one way to go? I don't think so either. But I think that in this mad rush of implementing these advanced directives, I think that much nuancing of thought that should have happened, much consideration about how that process of thinking of those future selves, and in what ways that I'm going to privilege which, is something that has got layered under this sort of blanket assumption that I can decide today for all future selves what is good. And I think there is a problem there, or there can be problem. It may work. It may work in some people, but my sense is that it will work where it, where it's probably not needed. In those really difficult cases where it was actually needed, this may not perhaps be the best way to go.
Okay. So do we have any further questions? And if not, I would like to thank you, Alok, for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you.
And it was a pleasure listening to you, and for raising sort of a very important concern, sort of in an interesting manner, where both philosophy, but also how should I say, sense of self, sources of self, other sort of ideas that one is dealing with in this exhibition season have been brought to the fore. And it's a difficult subject. So here we are. For those of you who have enjoyed the lecture today and would like to share it with your friends, do please direct them to our YouTube channel. Do consider signing up for a lecture on Hysteria, the Complex and Convoluted Persistence of an Idea by Sanjeev Jain. And another lecture, Mad People's History by Geoffrey Rome. I would also urge you to go see the exhibit that's been put together by Alok with Sanjeev Jain and Pratima Murthy, called The Asylum. It's based on their research in the history of psychiatric institutions in India. And Black Men's Minds, which is an exhibit that looks at forced institutionalization, and that might also be interesting for many of us. Do give us your feedback. Do register for future programs. Visit the exhibition site, please, and look forward to seeing you all soon again. Thank you very much, Alok, again. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.